Berlin, 30 January 1933. The winter air is biting, a frozen mist clinging to the grand stone facades of the Wilhelmstrasse. As dusk falls, the yellow glow of street lamps struggles against a rising tide of fire. Thousands of men in brown shirts, their jackboots rhythmically striking the cobblestones, march in a disciplined, endless column through the Brandenburg Gate. They carry aloft flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the neoclassical columns, turning the heart of the German capital into a sea of orange light and acrid smoke. High above, at a window of the Reich Chancellery, an elderly man with a thick mustache and a chest heavy with medals watches the procession. Paul von Hindenburg, the President of the Republic and a hero of the Great War, beats time to the military marches with his cane. In an adjacent window stands a younger man, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his arm raised in a stiff, relentless salute. Adolf Hitler has just been sworn in as Chancellor. To the onlookers, it appears to be a moment of national rebirth, a choreographed spectacle of unity. But beneath the brass bands and the cheers, a sophisticated political engine is starting to turn. This is the first hour of a 60-day countdown. In less than 2 months, the complex machinery of a modern European democracy will be systematically dismantled, not by a sudden military coup, but through the very laws designed to protect it. This is the story of how a nation's constitutional guardrails were turned into a ramp for absolute power. It matters because it demonstrates that democracy is not a natural state of rest, but a fragile construction that can be unmade by those who understand its internal mechanics better than its defenders. The collapse of German democracy in early 1933 was not an inevitable tragedy, but the result of a profound systemic failure that had been festering for years. Since the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Weimar Republic had been trapped in a spiral of economic and political paralysis. By 1932, unemployment had soared to 6 million, roughly 1 in 3 of the working population. The streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich had become battlegrounds for private armies of the political left and right. In the Reichstag, the national parliament, the situation was even more dire. The proportional representation system, intended to be the height of democratic fairness, had instead produced a fragmented mess of parties that refused to cooperate. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany was governed by a series of presidential cabinets, short-lived administrations that lacked a majority in parliament and relied entirely on the emergency decree powers of President Hindenburg. Democracy was already on life support, functioning only through the grace of an 85-year-old man whose mental faculties were beginning to dim. The traditional conservative elites, led by the aristocratic former Chancellor Franz von Papen, viewed the rising Nazi Party with a mixture of disdain and opportunism. They saw Hitler not as a visionary leader, but as a drummer, a populist agitator who could provide the mass support they lacked. Von Papen's strategy was deceptively simple. He would place Hitler at the head of a cabinet where the Nazis were in a tiny minority. In 2 months' time, Papen famously remarked, "We will have squeezed Hitler into a corner until he squeaks." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The conservatives believed they were hiring a puppet, but they had invited a demolition expert into the foundations of the state. The challenge facing the new government was to resolve the deadlock that had broken 3 previous chancellors. Yet Hitler had no intention of playing by the established rules of the parliamentary game. The weapon Hitler employed to shatter the Republic was not a new type of tank or aircraft, but a legal and administrative innovation known as the National Awakening. This was an expertly engineered process designed by the Nazi Party hierarchy, particularly the strategist Gregor Strasser before his fallout with the leader, and refined by the propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. The technical core of this operation was the co-option of the state's existing emergency infrastructure. Under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, the president could take emergency measures if public security and order were seriously disturbed. The Nazi innovation was to deliberately create the disorder that would justify the use of these powers. The party's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, functioned as a mechanical force of provocation. Numbering roughly 400,000 men by early 1933, a force 4 times larger than the professional German army, the SA was organized into local Stürme, or companies. Their operation was akin to a hydraulic press. They applied constant, escalating pressure on the streets to make the country feel ungovernable. Behind the scenes, the newly appointed Minister of the Interior for Prussia, Hermann Göring, began the rapid Nazification of the police force. He inducted 50,000 SA and SS members as auxiliary police, effectively giving a violent political militia the legal authority to carry out arrests. This was the technical solution to the problem of the law. If you cannot change the law overnight, you simply change the people who enforce it. The speed of this integration was staggering. Within weeks, the line between a party thug and a state official had been blurred into non-existence. They utilized the existing telegraphic and radio networks of the Prussian state to coordinate raids with the precision of a military campaign. By late February, the infrastructure for a police state was already in place, waiting for a single dramatic spark to justify its full activation. That spark arrived on the night of 27 February 1933. At approximately 9 o'clock, an alarm was raised at the Reichstag building. Within minutes, the massive gilded dome was a chimney for a ferocious inferno. Marinus von der Lubbe, a Dutch council communist, was discovered at the scene, shirtless and bewildered. Whether he acted alone or was a pawn in a larger game remains one of history's great debates. But for the Nazi leadership, the technicalities of his guilt were irrelevant. They immediately deployed a pre-prepared narrative. This was the signal for a Bolshevik uprising. The psychological impact on the German public was profound. The Reichstag was not just a building, it was the physical symbol of the nation's sovereignty. To see it burning was for many equivalent to seeing the nation itself under attack. Before the embers were even cold, Hitler and Göring were at the scene, declaring a national state of emergency. The very next day, they presented Hindenburg with the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, better known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. This single sheet of paper effectively suspended all the fundamental rights of the Weimar Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, and the privacy of postal and telegraphic communications were all abolished. It gave the central government the power to take over state governments and arrested thousands of political opponents without charge. In the space of 24 hours, Germany had shifted from a constitutional democracy to a country under permanent martial law. The decree was not a temporary measure. It remained in force for the next 12 years, forming the legal basis of the Third Reich. The operational deployment of this new power was immediate and ruthless. Throughout March 1933, the Brown Terror swept across Germany. In Berlin alone, the police and their SA auxiliaries conducted hundreds of raids every night. They targeted not just known communist activists, but social democrats, trade unionists, and journalists. The accounts from this period describe an atmosphere of sheer, unadulterated fear. The sound of a heavy lorry idling in the street at 3 in the morning became a signal for families to wait for the inevitable heavy knock on the door. The arrested were often taken to wild concentration camps, makeshift prisons set up in abandoned warehouses, brewery cellars, or disused factories. The most famous of these, Dachau, was described in the press as a political re-education center, but the reality was a laboratory for state-sponsored brutality. The psychological impact on the enemy forces, the political left, was devastating. The German Communist Party, once the largest in Europe outside the Soviet Union, was decapitated within days. Their leaders were in hiding or in protective custody, their printing presses smashed, and their communication networks severed. The Social Democrats, attempting to maintain a veneer of legality, found themselves campaigning for the March 5th elections while their speakers were being beaten and their posters torn down. The records of these weeks are a patchwork of official police logs and frantic whispered testimonies. While the exact number of those detained in this first wave is unknown, estimates suggest that by the end of March, at least 25,000 people were being held in some form of detention. If you are finding this account of the collapse of democracy interesting, a quick subscribe helps the channel more